The knock came just after sundown, when the prairie sky still burned with streaks of orange and violet. It was soft, almost timid, like the wind tapping at the warped wood of the ranch door. Eli McGraw set down his coffee, brow furrowing. No one came this far out after dark, not unless they were desperate or dangerous. The old hound by the hearth gave a low growl, ears pricked toward the door. Another knock. Louder this time. Eli's hand went to the rifle leaning against the table. Leg. He rose slowly, boots scraping against the floorboards. Who's there? His voice carried the grit of a man who'd spent too many years talking to cattle and not enough to people. No answer. Just the prairie wind sighing through the gaps in the eaves. He pulled the door open a cautious inch. She stood there, thin as a reed, hair wild with dust, eyes wide as the moon. An Apache girl, no older than 12, that her lips trembled, chapped and dry. In her arms, clutched tight against her chest, was a bundle wrapped in hide. She looked up at him with those dark, desperate eyes. Eli froze. Every story he'd heard in town came rushing back. Raids, scalps, settlers burned out of their homes. Folks said you couldn't trust an Apache as far as you could throw one. Yet here she was, alone. At his door. Please. Her voice cracked, raw from thirst. Help. The rifle felt heavy in his hand. But let's go back to where it all started. The McGraw Ranch sat 30 miles west of Fort Summer, a lonely stretch of prairie where grass grew high and neighbors kept to themselves. Eli had come out here after the war, looking for land and quiet. He found both, though the quiet weighed heavier as the years went on. His wife, Mary, had died giving birth to their first and only child. The baby hadn't made it either. Since then, it was just him, the cattle, and the wind. Eli had a reputation. In town, decent enough, but hard as barbed wire. He didn't drink much, didn't laugh much, and didn't forgive much. He ran his ranch the way he ran his life, steady, cautious, and far from trouble. The trouble, though, had a way of creeping in. That summer, tension had been high across the territory. The army had pushed the Apache off their hunting grounds, driving them to the edge of survival. Raids on supply wagons grew bolder. The townsfolk whispered about a war brewing. Eli kept his head down, same as always. He mended fences, branded calves, and watched the horizon for dust clouds that didn't belong. One evening, as he worked the herd back toward the barn, he spotted something strange on the northern ridge, a thin plume of smoke twisting into the sky. Not a campfire. Bigger than that. The hound barked, pacing the fence line. Eli tightened his grip on the reins, eyes narrowing. He didn't like it. Not one bit. By nightfall, the wind had shifted. Smoke still hung faintly in the air. Eli cooked beans over the stove, ate in silence, and tried to convince himself that whatever trouble was out there wouldn't find its way to his door. That's when he heard the knock. Now, standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, Eli felt the old instinct stirring in his chest, the one that told him to shut the door, bolt it, and send her back where she came from. But he didn't move. The girl swayed on her feet, clutching that bundle tighter. Please, she whispered again. Behind her, the prairie stretched endless and empty, bathed in the dying light. No horse, no tracks, just her. Eli looked at her for a long moment, jaw clenched tight, but he lowered the rifle. Get inside, he said quietly. She hesitated, like she didn't quite believe him. I said get in. Her bare feet stepped over the threshold, leaving faint smudges of dust on the wooden floor. Eli shut the door behind her, sliding the bolt into place. For the first time in years, the quiet in that house felt like it was holding its breath. Eli set the rifle back in its corner, but he didn't take his eyes off her. The girl stood just inside the door, shoulders hunched as though ready to run. The bundle in her arms shifted slightly, and Eli realized it wasn't just a bundle. A baby. Tiny, fragile, with skin as dark as the desert earth and eyes barely open. Eli swallowed hard. Lord Almighty. The girl whispered something in Apache, too soft for him to catch. Then, in broken English, he sick. No food. She looked so small standing there, dust caked on her legs, lips cracked, a tear cutting a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Eli motioned toward the table. Sit. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. You're safe. His voice came out rougher than he meant, but she obeyed, Easing into a chair with the baby cradled tight, Eli rummaged through the cupboards. He didn't keep much, some beans, jerky, a little flour. He poured a cup of water and slid it across the table. She took it in both hands, trembling as she drank. The baby stirred, weakly crying. Eli crouched to look at the infant. Feverish, skin hot to the touch. He knew enough to tell the child wasn't doing well that he set his jaw, stood, and fetched a blanket from the bed. Here, the girl wrapped the baby tighter, murmuring soft words in her own tongue. By morning, word had already spread. Eli had ridden into town for supplies. Milk, broth, anything that might help the baby. When he stepped into the general store, all conversation died. Hank Barlow, the blacksmith, narrowed his eyes. "You're keeping her?" Eli didn't answer. He picked up a sack of flour and set it on the counter. "You're playing with fire, McGraw," said another man near the stove. "You think folks here'll stand by while you feed the same kind that raided old Garrett's ranch last winter?" Eli kept his back to them, jaw tight. "Word is," Hank said slowly, "theirs. Apache camped up north. They see one of theirs with you. They might not take too kindly. And if the army finds out," Eli turned, eyes hard as flint. "You done talking, Hank?" The room went still. He paid for the supplies, gathered them into his saddlebag, and left without another word. When he returned to the ranch, the girl was sitting by the hearth, baby bundled in the blanket. She looked up at him as he stepped inside, half hope, half fear. Eli set the bag on the table and began pulling things out. "Brought milk. Some broth." She touched her chest. "Taya," she said softly, then pointed to the baby. "Nantan." Eli nodded. "Eli." She tried to mimic it, but it came out Ili. He almost smiled. Almost. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Eli sat across from her in the dim firelight. The baby slept, small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "You got folks looking for you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, eyes dropping to the floor. "No, all gone." Eli felt a pang in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt in years. The next few days passed slow but heavy. Eli fed the baby with a rag dipped in milk, while Taya watched, hands wringing nervously in her lap. The fever broke, little by little, but the child remained weak. Each night, Eli heard the distant howl of coyotes and wondered if soldiers, or Apache, were out there too. On the third day, he saddled his horse and rode the fence line, eyes scanning the horizon. Near the northern ridge, he found hoofprints, not from a ranch hand. Too many, too deep that he followed them a short ways before turning back, unease gnawing at him. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the prairie, a rider appeared in the distance. Eli watched from the porch, rifle in hand, as the man approached, a lanky rancher named Virgil Tate. Virgil reined up at the fence, face grim. "You got her here, don't you?" Eli didn't answer. "Listen to me, McGraw. Men in town are talking. They think you're harboring a raider's kin. Hank's riling him up good. Says we gotta run you out before you bring hell down on all of us." Eli's grip tightened. On the rifle, Virgil leaned in his saddle. "I'm telling you as a friend, send her away. Now, before this turns bad." Eli glanced toward the cabin window. Through the glass, he saw Taya holding Nantan close, rocking him gently. He turned back to Virgil. "Ain't happening." Virgil cursed under his breath. "Then you best be ready. Hank's gathering men tonight." Eli watched him ride away, dust trailing behind. The prairie was quiet again, but the silence felt sharper, heavier. Inside, Taya looked up at him, eyes full of unspoken questions. He didn't say a word, just slid the bolt across the door. The next morning broke with a strange stillness. No birds, no distant low of cattle, just the wind whispering through the dry grass. Eli saddled his horse before the sun was fully up. He didn't tell Taya where he was going. He just left her with a quiet nod, rifle slung over his shoulder. That he rode north, following the same ridge where he'd seen the tracks. The earth was torn up, deep hoofprints, more than a dozen horses. The trail led toward the riverbed, and as Eli dismounted to study the prints, a faint sound reached him. Drums, low, rhythmic, carried by the wind. Eli's throat tightened. He turned his horse back toward the ranch, spurring it hard. When he crested the last hill, he saw them, figures on horseback, far out on the plain. Maybe 20, maybe more. Riding slow, deliberate. Apache. Eli dismounted and led the horse inside the barn, keeping low. Taya was at the door, clutching Nantan. Her face paled when she saw his expression. "They're coming," Eli said quietly. She stepped back, shaking her head. "No fight. Please. I ain't looking for one." He barred the door, then checked his rifle. By midday, riders appeared on the far side of the pasture, silhouettes against the horizon. They didn't charge. They just sat their horses, watching. Taya whispered something in Apache, holding Nantan close. Eli didn't understand the words, but he felt the fear in her voice. The standoff stretched on, silent except for the wind. As dusk settled, Eli heard hoofbeats behind the house. He spun, rifle raised, only to see Virgil Tate ride up, 2 other men behind him. Virgil slid from his saddle. "They're watching you, Eli. Hank's got 10 men heading this way. Says, if you won't hand her over, he'll do it for you." Eli's jaw set. "Ain't happening. You'll get us all killed." Virgil's voice cracked with frustration. "You think they'll let you keep that girl? You're poking a hornet's nest with a stick." Eli glanced past Virgil at the figures still waiting on the horizon. "Maybe they ain't here for fighting." Virgil stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You don't know that." The sound of more horses rose in the distance. Hank Barlow and his men, riding hard, rifles glinting in the fading light. Virgil swore under his breath. "It's too late. They're coming." Eli stepped off the porch, rifle in hand. "Hank!" he shouted as the riders closed in. Hank reined up, face twisted in anger. "Hand her over, McGraw. You want war? 'Cause that's what you'll get. She ain't going nowhere." Eli's voice was steady, firm, but Hank's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll do it myself." He spurred his horse forward, but before he could close the gap, a sharp whistle split. The air, every man froze. From the ridge, Apache riders poured down like shadows in the dying light, moving fast but not firing a shot. They circled wide, stopping just out of range, weapons in hand but lowered. The leader, a tall warrior with a single white feather in his hair, rode forward slowly. His gaze locked on Eli. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the warrior spoke, his voice deep, calm, and deliberate. "You have her." Eli glanced back at Taya, standing in the doorway, clutching Nantan. "She came to me," Eli said. "She's safe." The warrior's dark eyes flicked to Hank and his men. "These men wish to take her." Hank shifted uneasily but said nothing. Eli nodded once. The warrior turned his gaze back to Eli. "And you?" Eli took a breath. "I'm not giving her up." The warrior studied him for a long, silent moment. Behind Eli, Hank muttered, "You're out of your damn mind, McGraw." Eli didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the warrior. The drums had stopped. The only sound was the creak of saddles and the wind rustling through dry grass. Finally, the warrior spoke again. "Then you will talk. Tonight. No guns. No blood." He dismounted, planting his spear in the earth. Eli lowered his rifle. Hank cursed, backing his horse. "This is suicide." Eli looked over his shoulder. "Then ride home, Hank. Nobody's stopping you." Virgil's eyes darted between the Apache and Eli, torn but silent. As the last of the light faded, Eli stepped forward to meet the warrior in the half-dark. Behind him, Taya stood in the doorway, holding Nantan as though the world might shatter if she let go. The fire burned low in the center of the yard, crackling softly in the still night. Eli sat cross-legged across from the Apache leader, the spear planted upright in the dirt between them. Around them, the 2 groups remained tense. Hank and his men by their horses, rifles half raised, and the Apache riders silent and watchful in the dark. Taya knelt just behind Eli, Nantan bundled in her arms. The baby whimpered weakly, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. The warrior spoke first, his words slow and deliberate. "She is my brother's child." He nodded toward Taya. "And that is his son." Eli's chest tightened. The man's gaze darkened. "Your soldiers came in winter. They killed the men, took the women. My brother, he did not live to see the spring." Eli didn't look away. "I wasn't part of that." The warrior studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the truth in his face. Then he turned his eyes toward Hank. "And these men, they don't care whose fault it is," Eli said quietly. "They just want her gone." The warrior's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "She came to you. You gave her water, food." Eli nodded once. "You could have given her to them. You did not." Eli's throat felt tight. I buried a wife and child on this land. Didn't feel right burying someone else's. For the first time, the warrior's hard expression shifted, just slightly. Taya moved closer, setting Nanton gently on Eli's lap. She placed a hand on the warrior's arm, speaking softly in Apache. Her voice trembled, but her words carried a weight that stilled the night. The warrior listened, eyes fixed on her. When she finished, he bowed. His head briefly. She says, he told Eli, that you are not like the soldiers, that you did not turn away. Eli looked down at Nantan, tiny fists clenched in restless sleep. Didn't seem like there was much of a choice. The warrior shook his head. Always choice. Behind them, Hank muttered under his breath, this is a damn waste of time. They're just buying time to gut us. Virgil shot him a sharp look. Shut your mouth, Hank. Hank spat in the dirt. You want to die talking to savages, that's your business. Eli turned, voice low but hard. Go home, Hank. You don't belong here. Hank sneered. What? You think they're gonna just thank you and leave? You're a fool, McGraw. But Hank's words faltered when Taya stepped past Eli, standing between the men and the Apache as though she were the only one keeping the two worlds apart. She said nothing, just looked at Hank with eyes full of something older than fear. Hank shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable under her gaze. The warrior rose to his feet slowly, never reaching for a weapon. Tomorrow, we take her back to our people. But tonight, he glanced toward Eli. We stay? No blood. Eli gave a small nod. The warrior turned to his riders, speaking in low tones. They dismounted silently, forming a circle on the edge of the firelight. Hank's men looked to him for direction, but Hank only glared at Eli before spurring his horse. This ain't over. Virgil hesitated, then followed slowly, casting Eli a conflicted look before disappearing into the darkness with the rest. Later, when the night had settled and the fire burned to embers, Eli sat outside the cabin, with Taya beside him. She looked up at him, her small face lit by the faint glow. Thank you, she whispered. Eli shook his head. Don't thank me yet. She tilted her head, not understanding. He looked out over the prairie, where the Apache sat in silence beneath the stars. Sometimes doing right don't feel much different than digging your own grave. Taya rested her head against his arm. For the first time in years, Eli let the quiet feel like something other than loneliness. In the middle of the night, Nanton stirred. His tiny cry woke both Eli and Taya. The warrior approached, crouched beside them. He spoke softly to the baby in Apache, a faint, bittersweet smile touching his lips. Then, unexpectedly, he placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. You have heart, rancher, he said. Few men left who remember how to use it. Eli met his eyes. There was no anger there anymore, just a heavy, shared understanding. The fire cracked once more, sparks rising into the night. For the first time since the knock on his door, Eli realized he was no longer just protecting them, but he was changing, too. Dawn came quiet. The prairie bathed in soft gold as the sun crept over the horizon. Dew clung to the grass, and a thin mist curled low across the pasture. Eli stepped outside, the boards creaking under his boots. Taya stood near the fire pit, Nanton swaddled against her chest. The Apache warriors were already mounted, silent and still, waiting like shadows carved from the morning light. The leader approached, his white feather glinting faintly in the sun. He stopped a few feet from Eli, meeting his eyes. It is time. Eli glanced at Taya. She was trying to be brave, but her fingers clutched Nantan like she might never let go. You sure she's safe with you? Eli asked, his voice low but steady. The warrior nodded. She is blood. She will have a home. Eli swallowed hard. And if the army comes again? The warrior's eyes darkened, but his voice stayed calm. Then we do as we always have. Fight, hide, survive. For a long moment, Eli just looked at Taya. She stepped closer, lifting Nanton slightly. You, good man, she said in her halting English. Not like others. Eli gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Don't reckon. I've been called that before. She reached up, small hand brushing the edge of his coat. We remember. The warrior dismounted and placed something in Eli's hand. A small carved pendant of bone, worn smooth with age. My brother made this. Keep it, so you do not forget. Eli turned the pendant over in his palm, feeling the weight of it. Won't. Taya climbed onto the warrior's horse. Nanton stirred in her arms, tiny face scrunching at the morning chill. She looked back at Eli one last time. For a second, Eli wanted to tell her to stay, to fight everyone in town. The army, even the Apache themselves, just to keep her safe. But he didn't. He raised a hand instead. A quiet farewell. She gave the smallest nod. The Apache rode off across the open land, their silhouettes growing smaller until they disappeared into the mist. Eli stood there a long time, the carved pendant still clutched tight in his hand. By noon, Virgil Tate rode up, eyes scanning the empty yard. They gone. Eli nodded. Virgil let out a slow breath. Hank's been stirring folks. Says you're a traitor for letting him walk. Eli didn't answer. He just looked out at the horizon where the riders had vanished. Virgil shook his head. You. No, you didn't have to do it. No one would have blamed you if you turned her over. Eli finally looked at him. That right? Virgil shrugged. World ain't built for men like you, Eli. You keep this up, you're gonna die lonely. Eli's gaze drifted back to the horizon. Been lonely a long time. That night, he sat by the hearth, the house as quiet as it had been before the knock. Except now, it felt different. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the pendant. For the first time in years, he thought about Mary, about the child they'd buried before it ever had a name. Maybe helping Taya and Nanan hadn't changed the world, but it had changed something in him. Months passed. Rumors drifted through town of an Apache girl seen near the trading post, speaking bits of English, her baby strong and healthy. One mentioned Eli. He didn't need them to. Sometimes, when he rode the ridge at sunset, he thought he saw figures in the distance. Riders watching, never approaching, never threatening. Just there, he'd tip his hat, slow and deliberate, before turning back toward home. Years later, when Eli was an old man with hair as white as prairie snow, a young woman rode up to his ranch. She dismounted, tall and sure of herself, a boy of 10 at her side. Eli McGraw? She asked, voice steady but warm. He studied her face, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. Taya? She smiled softly. You remember. Eli reached for the pendant still hanging by his hearth. Always. The boy stepped forward, eyes wide as he looked up at Eli. This, Taya said gently in her native tongue, is the man who chose kindness when no one else would. Eli felt something in his chest loosen, like a knot finally undone. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the three of them sat by the fire, the night calm and full of quiet peace. For the first time in his life, Eli didn't feel like a man waiting to die. He felt like someone who'd finally done something worth living for.